The bandwidth for this episode of the Power Factor Show is brought to you by the Firearms Radio Network. FirearmsRadio.tv.
Sponsored by Taylor Freelance, Rainier Ballistics, Hodgson Powders, and JPL Precision.
Hey Power Factor fans, I'm Rick, and this is going to be the second installment in the saga of the Springfield Range Officer. A few episodes back, I showed off my new Springfield Range Officer 45, which I won, I was awarded a few months ago, and I've had a chance to shoot it now in one IDPA match, but of course you can't leave the gun alone. You've got to maximize its performance to make you happy. And there were some features on the gun that I pointed out on the original review, and of course you'll find many reviews of the Range Officer on YouTube and whatnot, but I just wanted to kind of go through the steps that I go through to make the gun satisfy my needs. And one of the beauties of the 1911 style pistol is that a lot of the parts are interchangeable with other parts to make the gun, let's say to make the grip circumference smaller or larger, to make the reach to the trigger longer or shorter. You can add ambidextrous controls, you can put in heavier springs, lighter springs, all these different things you can do to the gun. And I'm just going to go through how I've modified the gun to make me happy. So here's the Range Officer as it sits now here at the end of December in 2014. I'll just run through the changes top to bottom. I have used this gun for IDPA. It would also be suitable for USPSA single stack. But as I mentioned in the initial episode that I did, that there were some changes that I was going to have to make. Now, one of those changes is the ambidextrous thumb safety. One of the cost-saving features on the gun, or one of the features that's been deleted in the interest of cost savings, is the ambidextrous safety that is available on virtually every other model that Springfield makes. Now, I at one time had a Springfield high cap 1911, and it came with a single-sided safety, as does the Range Officer. And a guy on one of the 1911 forums was saying, oh, you know, I'd like to get rid of the ambidextrous safety. I think he had a loaded or a trophy match or something. And so I said, hey, I'll swap you my single-sided safety off my high cap for the ambi safety on your loaded. And so we just made a straight swap. And so I happen to have an ambidextrous Springfield brand ambidextrous safety in my parts box. And it's a part that I've installed many times, because every 1911 pretty much has passed through my hands as I've had to install an ambidextrous safety on it. So it's just a matter of getting in there. I'm going to talk about some gunsmithing stuff that I do, and even if I use the phrase you do this or you could do that, I just want to emphasize that what I'm talking about is what I've done on my gun. I'm willing to accept the risk of modifying my gun and being responsible for the results of my handiwork. If you're not, feel free to send your gun off to a gunsmith and have a professional do it. But half the fun of owning 1911 style pistols for me is doing my own gunsmithing work. So I'll describe some techniques that I've used, resources that I've used, but again, it's not necessarily a recommendation or even instruction. This is just kind of standard covering my Heine disclaimer. Things that I've done that I do to my pistols, and I'll detail those, but again, don't necessarily consider it to be instruction or recommendation on my part. It's just a description of the process that I've gone through. So the ambidextrous safety, of course, has a lever on each side, so that if you're left-handed or right-handed, there's a lever that falls under your thumb, and there's some fitting involved on the inside of the gun. The either safety, ambidextrous or single-sided, there's a small little boss that fits through the frame inside the magwell, or behind the magwell actually, and it blocks the movement of the sear. And that part on most parts that you buy aftermarket, let's say if I were going to put a Ed Brown ambidextrous safety in my Springfield, that part would be oversized enough that some material would generally have to be removed to get it to fit intimately to the sear. so that it acts as a safety. If you've got a gap in there, there isn't firm contact between the safety and the sear, it's not going to work. So the parts are generally oversized, and that has to be fitted on this side. There's a hole in the frame where the safety fits through, and then of course the pin, the axle pin that the safety is rotating on, is the same pin that the grip safety rides on. Now, besides just the function, when you've got the safety in the on position, the gun won't fire. You can hear that nice click as the safety goes on and off. And it's just a positive feel that there's no doubt that it's on, that it's off. It's smooth in its function, but you want there to be enough resistance that you're not likely to bump it on or bump it off accidentally. And there's a little bit of art to that. You've got the plunger tube on this side of the frame that bears on the face of the safety. And this safety, when I got it, there was essentially no detent on the face of it for the plunger to fit in. So I didn't have this nice snick on and off. There was just kind of a mushy sliding of the part. So I had to do a little detail work. I just got out a electric drill and drilled the detent where I needed it so that when the safety was in the off and on position, you just had a nice positive sense and feel to it. And I've got an assortment of small files here, flat file, round file, triangular file, and I just use those to make the small, tiny little removal of material that you need to make to fit a safety. And if you're using the same brand part as your pistol, you generally can get away with less fitting. For instance, the fit of the sear to the safety was almost perfect without any need to mess with it. But even though the safety function worked, I still had to put some time into getting that nice, secure, consistent click, click, click action on the safety, and it's really quite satisfactory. Now, another thing I mentioned in other episodes is when you're using the traditional, what I call Swenson style safety that's retained on this side by the grip panel overlapping this little finger here that extends under the grip. That's what kind of helps hold the two pieces together. If you've got factory cut ambidextrous grips, and this Springfield pistol does come with pre-cut grips, they're often overcut to the extent that when the safety is in the off position, it's just kind of hanging. You'll see that the safety is not in contact with the grip panel up here at the top, and it wasn't in contact with this recessed area in the back of the grip. So when I was holding the gun and riding the safety with my thumb, all of the torque that's being applied to that lever would be transferred to this little tongue and groove pin joint that's in the middle here, in the middle of the grip safety that connects the two halves together. And so I cut the corner off of a credit card and made a little shim, or just a little, you can see it, it's just a little white piece of plastic that I've inserted in there so that when the safety is in the off position and I'm riding on it with my thumb, that the safety has a hard stop against that inner side of the recess rather than it just kind of hanging out in the air. And I think that's what causes ambi safeties to loosen up over time, is as you're riding that safety with your thumb, the torque is being applied to the pin joint. And the way I've got it set up now, the safety is riding hard against the inside of the grip panel. So when I've got the safety off and I'm riding it with my thumb, there's no torque being applied to that pin. And that's just something that, that's why I generally buy grips that do not have the ambi safety recess already cut in them and do it myself, so I can make the recess exactly the depth and exactly the size that I need it. So that was the first step, and actually when I shot the match with this gun, that was the only modification I'd made at that time, was the ambidextrous safety, because that's the only thing that I really needed to change on it just to be able to use it effectively in a match. I had to have the ambidextrous safety on it. But of course I had other plans. There were other changes that I wanted to make on it. One of the changes that I mentioned is that I was going to get a fiber optic front sight on it, and so I ordered a new Dawson fiber optic front. It's a part that I've used on 2 or 3 other guns in the past, and I knew exactly that that's the part that I wanted. They come made for different dovetail sizes, so if you've got a Springfield or you've got a Kimber, they make a part that fits your dovetail. It's a part that you can install at home. I did install it myself. One of the things I noticed was that as the gun came out of the box, the rear sight seemed to be awfully high. I mean, you want to, the whole idea of an adjustable sight is you want to be able to adjust it up and down to suit your load, but it seemed to be cranked up awfully tall. And one of the knocks on adjustable sights is they're kind of big and bulky, and if you bump them into things, you can damage them. And so I didn't like the fact that the rear sight was was riding so high above the slide. So I measured the front sight, and it measured, the factory sight measured about 0.185 inch. So I thought I could use a slightly shorter front sight, which meant that I could crank the rear sight down a few clicks so it would nestle down closer to the top of the slide, but I would still have plenty of vertical adjustment both up and down. So I bought the Dawson sight. It's 0.10, 1/10 of an inch in width, and 0.170 in height. So I could lower my rear, to maintain my zero, I could lower my sight 0.015, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's visibly lower in the slide. And so I think that was a good selection to get the slightly shorter front sight than the stock one. Now, Dawson provides, when they send it to you, even though there's, you know, the usual disclaimers about have your gun worked on by a gunsmith, make sure that the safeties have been checked before you've messed with anything or after you've messed with it. But of course, they also send you instructions on how to install the fiber in the front sight, and then how to install the sight itself in the gun. They provide this little aluminum drift, instructions on how to determine where the material needs to be removed. The factory front sight was just a plain black serrated ramp sight that's held in the slide with a pin. And luckily, the pin is it's not a blind hole. It's drilled all the way through the front sight into the slide. So I could just use a small diameter punch like this, drift, and drift the pin out, just punch it straight out the bottom, and then drive the dovetailed sight out of its grooves, you know, out of the dovetail in the front. And it wasn't in there extremely tight. It was pretty easy to drive it out. And then following the directions provided by Dawson, I was able to install the front sight. I took the slide off and mounted it in a bench vise so I could, it wasn't going to move around, and I would be able to get both hands on it. And the Dawson sight dovetail was just slightly larger than the dovetail cut in the slide, which is of course exactly the way you want it, so that it's not loose in some guns and tight in others. You make it slightly oversized, and then you just have to reduce it slightly to fit whatever dovetail variation, little intolerances that there may be. So I had to do like a half a dozen strokes on the bottom of the dovetail on the sight. You always work on the cheap part. Sight's much cheaper than a slide. So just a half a dozen file strokes on the bottom of the sight, and I just tapped it in there with using the punch or the drift provided by Dawson, and a little. I just have this little mallet from Brownells, brass on one end, plastic on the other. Took about 15 whacks to center it. And I think it's centered. There's different methods of centering. One of the methods they show is setting the gun on a flat surface and then measuring from the surface to the top of the sight, then flipping the gun over and making that measurement again, and that will tell you if it's centered or not. But of course, that assumes that the slide itself is machined evenly on both sides, and that the barrel is centered within the slide. And so I don't know that that's necessarily the case. So what I did was just there's a little bit of the dovetail flat showing on either side of the front sight, and I was just able to measure that little flat with a caliper, and made sure that the flat is exactly the same width on either side of the dovetail. And the sight looks like it's centered. If I have to put in more than a couple of clicks of windage to center it on target, I'll just bang it over, give it another whack with the hammer. But I think it looks like it's centered adequately, that with a fully adjustable rear sight, there should be no issue getting it on target. Some other changes I made. I just, for the sake of a little bling, I polished the sides of the hammer. The hammer was all black, and I just thought, well, I've got the stainless barrel with the stainless bushing, and you can see the barrel there exposed in the ejection port, and I thought a little bling at the back would look nice, so I just polished the sides of the hammer. That's, you know, not functional at all, but I thought it looked kind of cool. The other thing is I prefer the arched mainspring housing. Almost all new 1911 style pistols for sale today, single stack pistols, use a flat housing, and Springfield's no different. I have a collection of arch mainspring housings laying around. Here's one that I just happen to have in my parts box, so that anytime I get a pistol that's got a flat housing, I've got a supply of arched housings to put in there. I've got steel ones and plastic ones, and maybe even have an aluminum one, but it's an easy part to swap. The mainspring housing that's supplied by Springfield has their ILS locking system, and I don't have anything against that one. I don't have any feelings about the lock one way or another, but if you change to a standard mainspring housing that does not have the locking system in it, you also need to change the internals. The ILS uses a proprietary mainspring, and the mainspring cap and the other internal components are different. So if you want to swap out the housing or just not disable the ILS system, you can't just put a new spring in the ILS housing. You've got to replace the plunger and all the other little internal bits. And while I was at it, I put in a 23-pound mainspring, which is the standard GI power, since time immemorial. 23 pounds has been standard. A lot of people like reduced power on their mainspring, usually in the interest of a little bit lighter trigger pull. But if I want to mess with my trigger pull, I do the work on the trigger, not on the mainspring. So 23-pound mainspring. Now that brings us to the trigger. Now when you talk about the trigger job on a 1911, the trigger itself really doesn't contribute much to the trigger pull. All the trigger does is transmit the movement of your fingertip to the back around the two sides of the magazine, and to the center at the back where the disconnector and the sear are bearing on it. And so when they talk about a trigger job, really all you really want the trigger to do is to be tight in the frame so that it's not sloppy, but not so tight that it binds. You want to be able to if you tip the gun up, the trigger will fall to the back. If you tip the gun down, the trigger will fall to the front. It's not binding in there. And so when you hear about the trigger job, really the trigger itself isn't doing a whole lot of the work. Most of where the rubber meets the road on a trigger job is where the sear and the hammer interact. Now you have here's your sear and your hammer, and there are full cock notches on the face of the hammer that mate up to the sear, and the amount of overlap that you have between the sear nose and the hammer hooks can along with spring pressure, determine the weight of the pull and some of the kind of subjective qualities. Is it crisp? Is it creepy? And so there's fitting that has to be done there. And where I started was Springfield's specifications for the trigger pull on the Range Officer, I think, is about 5.5 pounds. And for most competition shooters, that is going to be too heavy. Experienced competition shooters will want their triggers a lot of times down around 3 pounds, even 2.5 pounds. And once you get to a certain point where you start adjusting some of the internal components, you not only can improve the performance of the gun, but you start running into possibilities of making the gun less reliable and even unsafe. The internal components that you're going to deal with if you want to adjust either the objective side of the trigger pull, what is the weight, what is the resistance, the pound of resistance to the trigger finger, and then some of the subjective senses of, is the trigger crisp, does it break like glass, is it a rolling trigger? These different elements can be adjusted by working on how tall the hammer hooks are, the amount of engagement surface on the sear nose, how much pressure is being applied to the disconnector and sear by the sear spring. And I have been doing my home gunsmithing, trying to improve without screwing up my guns for about 20 years. This is where I started with my resources, is Halleck's 45 Auto Handbook. I don't even know if it's in print anymore. It's just a neat, simple description of how to do everything from how to hold your gun to how to do little gunsmithing operations on it, fitting a bushing, adjusting the extractor tension, and this is what got me started. And I graduated from Halleck's handbook to the Kuhnhausen manuals, and I think most people who do any kind of work on their 1911s are familiar with these. It's a shop manual series that has all the information you could possibly want on dimensions and materials and how the parts interact. There's all these exploded drawings that show you every component, troubleshooting, all kinds of information in there. And I have pretty much read these books cover to cover in pursuit of my home gunsmithing. But again, it's one of those things where if it's something you want to pursue, be very certain that you're willing to take on the responsibility for the results of your work, because you can have issues that are not just functional, the gun doesn't run, but safety issues. And where I like my trigger is a crisp release with between 3 1/4 and 3 3/4 pounds of pull weight. Some people prefer, a lot of people say, for a carry gun or a duty gun, 4 to 5 pounds is better. Some experienced shooters, I know like Steve, when he was shooting USPSA, he preferred about a 2.5 pound trigger on his gun. I like, again, 3 1/4, 3 3/4. And you can get a good pull, a good quality trigger pull in that range of weights without doing a lot of work. The key to maintaining a durable and safe trigger pull is where the sear nose and the hammer hooks, the full cock notch on the hammer, interact with each other, and then how much spring pressure you have essentially holding those surfaces in contact. Now here's a neat tool, trigger pull gauge. You just like weighing your fish, you hook it on the trigger, and when the hammer drops, you can read the scale here. It tells you what the pull weight is. Now again, when I got the gun, it was about 4.5 pounds. Took the gun apart, field stripped it, and just did a detailed examination of all the internal components. So for instance, the sear, you want to make sure that the sides of the sear are smooth and flat. You don't want there to be any rough spots or burrs that can catch on any edges, the machined edges inside the frame. Same with the hammer. Sides of the hammer need to be flat. The hammer hooks need to be of equal height. There's also some variation in opinion of how tall the hammer hook should be, which affects how much overlap there is between the hook and the sear nose. 0.020 inch is generally kind of, I think most people consider that to be kind of the minimum. So if your hammer hooks are shorter than that, you might need a new hammer. If they're taller than that, they can be finely adjusted. I use essentially an automotive shim style gauge to determine the height of the hammer hooks and just measure them. And if they're too tall, you can use, I have India stone, Arkansas stones. They're really valuable for adjusting the dimensions of fine parts. I mean, we're working within 1/1000th of an inch are the kind of tolerances you're working with, and the sides on these it's 90-degree corners and nice and flat. If you want to polish a surface and make sure that it's flat and smooth, you don't run the risk of adding a curve to it or making it uneven by using, say, an abrasive cloth that you're holding in your hand. The tips of your fingers are round, and you're not going to be able to maintain a flat surface with a handheld abrasive. If you've got a nice flat surface like this, or a file that you know is flat, it helps maintain the flat surfaces. I don't mess with the actual contact surface of the hammer hook and the sear nose. I will alter the height of the hooks on the hammer to get to that 0.020. I will add a secondary breakaway angle on the sear, but the actual surfaces where they touch, I've always left that alone. Steve has a jig there that he uses, and he does recut those surfaces And again, that's in the interest of getting an even lighter trigger pull. But for the 3 1/4 to 3.5 pound pull that I like, I have not had to mess with those surfaces. So after I confirm the height of the hammer hooks and get make sure the sides are flat, I will then start in on the sear spring. Now the sear spring is pushing forward. This middle leg is pushing forward on the disconnector and the trigger. The left leg is pushing forward on the sear, and the amount of pressure being applied by the spring dramatically affects the pull weight of the trigger. It's kind of like, for instance, people will reduce the rating on their mainspring in the interest of reducing the trigger pull weight. Well, if you reduce the mainspring from 23 pounds to 21 pounds, you might knock a few ounces off the trigger pull. You drop it from 23 to 19 to 15, you can drop, maybe half a pound off the trigger pull. But if you start adjusting the sear spring, the result is more nearly 1-to-1. If you reduce the pressure on the sear spring by 8 ounces, you're going to reduce your trigger pull weight by about 8 ounces. So you can do some fine adjustments on the legs of the sear spring. You need about a minimum of 8 ounces pressing forward on the sear and 8 ounces pressing forward on the disconnector for a combined 1 pound of resistance. That's about the minimum that you can go for a safe trigger pull. I've got this sear spring in the Range Officer adjusted to about 3/4 of a pound on each leg. So when I had the sear spring installed and the disconnector and the trigger, it took about 3/4 of a pound, 9 or 10 ounces, to move the center leg of the sear spring. And then when I added the sear, the total pull weight was about 1.5 pounds with just the sear disconnector trigger installed. And so with that resistance, reassembled the gun, the trigger pull weight was about 3 1/4 pounds. And you can just confirm all this discussion of the resistance. I was just using this scale to measure it. So with 3/4 of a pound of resistance on the sear, 3/4 of a pound resistance on the disconnector, 0.020 inch hammer hooks, I got a 3 1/4 pound pull. It's crisp. The trigger comes with an over travel screw to get no more over travel than necessary. A lot of people like the sense that the trigger is stopping at the instant the hammer drops, and so you can adjust that over travel to get that to feel the way you want. I also changed the factory recoil spring. I think it's about a 16 pounder. I changed that to a 14 pounder since I'm going to be using exclusively major power factor 200 grain at 850 feet per second loads. You can reduce the rating on the the recoil spring a little bit. Some people I know go even lower. They go 12 pounds, but I like the 14. And so the gun is rounding out pretty well the way I want it. I mean, I've got, the factory does a pretty good job of beveling the mag well. I may or may not get a funnel on there, but I've got my sights the way I want them with the Dawson fiber optic. Just a little bit of tweaking and polishing on the trigger. Got it down from about 4.5 pounds to 3 1/4 pounds. Got my arched mainspring housing on here because that's the one that feels good in my hand. So it's pretty much set up the way I want it. Didn't take a whole lot of time or energy. Just familiarity with how the gun operates. Very limited supply of fine files and stones. And it's really not difficult if it's something you want to pursue yourself. But of course, not everybody is interested in it, and if you're not, there's no shame in sending it to your local gunsmith, and of course, he or she will be glad to get your business. But if you want to pursue your own gunsmithing on a limited basis like this, where I didn't get into anything like milling or drilling or lathe turning or anything, it's all just kind of adjusting the fit of the factory components. It's really not that tough. And again, it really increases my enjoyment of the shooting sports. It's just like hand loading your ammo or anything else. The more you're involved in it, I think the more you enjoy it. One other quick note: the gun came with Torx grip screws, And I don't know if they save a nickel on each grip screw by going with Torx, but that was one of the first changes I made, was replace those with standard slotted grip screws. So the gun, again, it's pretty much set up the way I want it. I'll probably get some new grips and cut the recess myself for the Ambi. But other than that, maybe a refinish. I thought about maybe going with NP3, something rust resistant. But maybe I'll get it engraved with my initials and paint it pink or something instead. But there it is. There's the Range Officer, pretty close to being optimized for my use. Ready for another match. Oh, and I did shoot a match. I mentioned that I shot an IDPA match with the gun. I put about 130 rounds through it, 5 rounds to determine that the gun was hitting a little bit low. Put in 5 clicks of elevation to get it on target. So I had about 10 rounds for sight in, then about 120 rounds for the match, and the gun ran perfectly. I had no functional issues. I did notice that the first couple of stages, I had this sense that the slide was closing. I mean, it's just a sense of slight hesitation in closing, and I put that down to break-in. I mean, I don't know if that was there was a little bit of dryness still. There's a little bit of area that wasn't lubed maybe as sufficiently as it could have been. But just maybe the first stage or two, I just had a little bit of a sense of the slide closing, just the last little bit of movement. But then that completely went away. So there could have just been a little burr or something. But people, I think, are reluctant to buy a gun that they think they have to shoot it in order to get it to run. You know, it's like, oh, put 100 rounds through it, or put 300 rounds through it, or 500 rounds through it, and then you can make a determination about how reliable it is. This gun, I've got 130 rounds through it, and it's run perfectly. So that's a good sign for the future. But I'll keep reporting back on it. We'll maybe do some more. I'll do maybe a range test on it, and we'll see it in action instead of me just talking about it. But there you go, installment 2 on Springfield Range Officer.